Hello everyone, my name is Masha and today in collaboration with BraceletBook, I'm going to teach you how to make normal patterns. If you've never heard about BraceletBook before, today's your lucky day. It's a great resource to find different patterns, photos, videos and tutorials, as well as a great place to connect with other people who share your hobby. You can meet and talk to people in the chat, add them as friends and message directly, and you can always find help in the forums with your bracelet questions. So as I said, this video is made in collaboration with BraceletBook, so today I'm going to be using their website to demonstrate how to read normal patterns. This video is going to contain a lot of information that may be overwhelming, so I've left timestamps for each of the sections in the description and in the pinned comment under this video, so you can easily find the section that you're looking for and go back if you need to. Going into this tutorial, I expect that you know how to make the basic knots. There are 4 main friendship bracelet knots that are going to be referenced in the pattern. You need to know how to make them and be comfortable with making them before you're going to be ready to read patterns. If you don't feel like you're ready, don't worry, I have a separate video tutorial on how to make the basic knots. I suggest you watch that first and then come back to this video. And one last thing, if you've never made bracelets before, I really do not suggest you go straight away into reading patterns. I highly recommend you try the chevron bracelet first. The chevron is a very simple bracelet that allows you to practice both forward and backward knots, thus preparing you for more difficult patterns. And with that as well, I do have a separate tutorial that I will be linking in the description as with everything else. So now that we've gone over that, let's get into the tutorial. There are 2 different ways of reading normal patterns. There's the standard row by row method, which is usually the method that people start off by using. Then there's also the segment knotting method, which is a little bit more difficult but saves you a lot of time in the long run. Now for both of these, I will be going into detail a little bit later. So first, let's find a pattern. I'm going to go on braceletbook.com. I'm going to click on patterns, and for this specific pattern I know the exact pattern number, so I'm going to click pattern number and type in the number that I'm looking for, which in my case is pattern number 2, which is the chevron. I'm going to apply the filters and the pattern comes up right here on screen. So this is the pattern for the regular chevron bracelet. Now hopefully if you've taken my advice, you've already tried making this bracelet before, and looking at the pattern it might be a little bit confusing to you. But don't panic, let's just analyze the pattern. Now if you look closely, the pattern is made up of several different elements. You have these lines coming out of the pattern at the top and at the bottom. These lines represent different strings. Each line is assigned a letter and a colour, both of which help you distinguish between the lines, between the strings. Next you can see that there are multiple different circles in the pattern. These circles contain different arrows. Each circle represents a knot, and the arrow inside the circle indicates what type of knot it is. Hopefully you've watched my basic knots tutorial, and that way you know that there are 4 different types of knots in friendship bracelets. The forward knot, which is represented by an arrow to the right, the backward knot, which is represented by an arrow to the left, the forward backward, which is represented by an arrow to the right and back, and the backward forward, which is represented by an arrow to the left and back. In the chevron pattern, we can see forward knots represented by an arrow to the right and backward knots represented by an arrow to the left. Each knot within the pattern is made between 2 strings, and you can see which strings they are by looking at what lines are going into the knot. So this first one here is made between a yellow and an orange string, an A and a B. This second one is also between a yellow and an orange string, but it's B and A in that order. If you have more colours, it's going to look a little bit more complicated, of course. Now let's look into the next element of the pattern. You can notice that on the left and on the right, you've got these numbers, and you also have horizontal lines going through the pattern. These lines represent the rows, and the numbers represent the row number. Each pattern consists of a certain amount of rows. This specific pattern consists of 4. You might be wondering, how do you make an entire bracelet when there's just 4 rows? If you take a closer look, you will realize that the pattern loops. So once you reach the 4th row, you have to go back to row number 1, and you continue making the bracelet until it reaches the length that you want. Now let's dive into a little bit more of theoretical knowledge. When you're setting up your strings to make a bracelet, you have to pay very close attention to the pattern and make sure that your strings are in the exact order as the strings in the bracelet. So if I were to make this bracelet, I would order my strings with a yellow, then 2 orange, 2 yellow, 2 orange, and 1 yellow. As I said before, each knot is made between 2 strings. And you can see which strings are going into the knot by looking at the lines that are going into the knot. The 4 basic knots of friendship bracelets do 4 different things to your strings. The forward knot moves the string on the left to the right and makes a knot of its color. So you can look at the first knot here. The knot between the yellow and orange string is a forward knot, which will move the yellow string to the right while making a knot of its color. The backward knot moves the string on the right to the left while making a knot of its color. So for example, this 4th knot right here is also between a yellow and an orange string. This time the yellow string is on the right, and a backward knot is moving the yellow string to the left and is also making a knot of its color. We will get into forward, backward and backward forward knots a little bit later, as they are a little bit more complex. I should also mention that on BraceletBook, if at any point you forget which arrow represents which knot, you can hover your mouse over a knot to highlight it and then click that knot to have a diagram show up of which knot to make. This feature can be pretty handy if you're a beginner. In normal patterns, all of the strings work together to create the design. The strings move along the bracelet as you're making different knot types. You may notice that the rows alternate between an even and odd number of knots. So in this pattern, the first row has 4 knots, the second has 3, the third has 4 again, and the fourth 3 again. The way I like to explain this is by an analogy. I always think back to when I was a child and I was playing with Lego. Whenever I wanted to build a house and I put down 2 bricks, I needed to seam these 2 bricks together in the next row. So when I was making the second row of the house, I would always put a brick in the middle on top of the seam between the first 2. That way I seam the 2 bricks together and make sure that they're stable. If I were to just stack bricks on top of each other, the wall wouldn't be connected and it would break easily. The same sort of logic applies to friendship bracelets. When you're making a row, you're just making knots between pairs of string. To make that into a bracelet in the next row, you have to change the pairs, taking 1 string from the first pair and 1 string from the second pair to make a knot between them, essentially closing that seam just like in the Lego. However, that does mean that you're also leaving 2 strings out, and here in this pattern on the second row, for example, it's represented by the orange string on the left and on the right. There are no knots made with that string for that row. And then on the third row it goes back to being 4 knots again. I hope that analogy made sense because that was a stretch. Alright, so now that we've analysed the pattern and looked into some theoretical knowledge, let's talk about the differences between the 2 methods of knotting. So as I said previously, there is the row by row method, which is pretty self-explanatory, it goes row by row, and there is the segment knotting method, in which you knot in segments. Now chances are, if you've ever made a chevron bracelet, you've probably used the segment knotting method without even knowing it. Let's look into the row by row method and hopefully you'll realise what I'm talking about. So as the name suggests, in the row by row method, you follow the pattern very closely, row by row. So first of all, you would start by arranging your strings as the pattern suggests. And again, to do that, you look at the top of the pattern where the strings are, and you arrange your strings in the exact same order as those lines are arranged. Now to make the pattern row by row, you would start with the first row, the first knot on the left. You would take the first pair of strings, in this case that's a yellow and an orange, and you would make the knot that is represented. In this case, it's a forward knot. After completing that knot, you would take the next pair of strings, in this case that is the orange and the yellow, and you would make the knot that is represented there, which is again a forward knot. Next, you would take the next pair of strings, do that knot, then the next pair of strings, and so on until you reach the end of the row. Once you reach the end of the row, you would go to the second row. Now, as I mentioned before, in the second row, the string on the left and the string on the right, which are represented by the orange strings here, aren't used. So you would put them aside and regroup all of your strings. So in this case, you would put the 2 yellow strings together, the 2 orange strings, and then the 2 yellow strings again. And again, focusing on this row from left to right, you would take the first pair of strings, make a knot between them, as the pattern suggests. In this case, it's a forward knot. Then the second pair of strings, do that knot between them, and then the third, and so on until you reach the end of the row. Next, you would focus on the third row, doing the exact same thing, and the fourth row, and so on until you reach the end of the pattern. Once you do reach the end of the pattern, you would loop right back to the first row and start the pattern again from the leftmost knot of the row. If you're wondering what are the different ways to start and finish your bracelets, I have a whole series of tutorials on different ways to do that, and there is a separate playlist that will be linked in the description for you to check out in your own time. Alright, so perhaps you now feel comfortable with making the chevron. Let's look at a more difficult pattern. Now again, going on BraceletBook.com, I can click the Patterns tab and I can search by a specific keyword. In this case, I want to find a pattern with a heart. So I'm going to type in heart, and I'm going to order them by oldest, because easier patterns tend to be the oldest ones. And I'm going to apply my filters. As you can see, there are a bunch of different patterns that have come up. I like this one, however. I like this pattern, however, I don't necessarily like these colours. I can already see that there are 20 variations, so a lot of different people have already added their colours. But none of the colours that are added here suit the ones that I want to do. I'm going to click the Add a Variation button. On this screen, I can click the specific colours and alter them to any colour that I want. This is a great way to test different colours in a pattern without having to make the bracelet. But also, if you're already set on a colour combination, by changing the colours in the pattern, it makes the pattern easier for you to follow. I want white and pink, so I'm going to change the background colour to white and the heart colour to be pink. I'm now going to click Save and Test, and if I want to, I might also click Submit to the site for the admins to review. Now this pattern will be easier to follow with the colours that I've got. So looking at this pattern, it's exactly the same principle. I'm going to arrange my strings in the way that they are arranged in the pattern. It's the top of the pattern where the lines are sticking out that indicate the order in which the strings should be. So in this case, I've got a white string, a pink string, white, pink, pink, white, pink, white. So by following the row by row method, I'm going to look at the first row, the first knot on the left, and I'm going to start by making that. In this case, it is a forward-backward knot. Now, as I said before, a forward knot moves the string on the left to the right and makes a knot of its colour. The backward knot moves the string on the right to the left and makes a knot of its colour. But the forward-backward knot doesn't move any string anywhere. Both of the strings end up in the same position as they were before the knot, but a knot is made of the string that is on the left. So if we look closely here, I've got a white string going to the right and back, making a knot on the pink string, but both of the strings stay in the same position. Now if we look on the fourth knot here on the first row, it's a backward forward knot. A backward forward knot, again, doesn't move the strings anywhere, they both stay in the same position. However, a knot of the string on the right is made. So in this case, the string on the left is pink, the string on the right is white. Both strings stay in the same position after the knot as they were before, but a knot of the white color is made. So with the row by row method, looking at the first knot on the first row, I would grab the first pair of strings and do a forward backward knot. Once I've done that, I would take the next pair of strings, do a forward knot as the pattern suggests, then the next pair of strings, a backward knot, then the next with a backward forward knot, and so on until I reach the end of the pattern, which I already have, and then I would proceed to the second row. In the second row, I have to rearrange my strings. The two outermost strings, the two white strings on the left and on the right, don't take part in this row, so I need to arrange my strings by the two pink, two white, and two pink in the center. And following the second row, I would do one forward knot between the two pink strings, one forward knot between the two white strings, and one backward knot between the two pink strings again. So that is the principle of reading the pattern row by row. I will continue reading that pattern in the same way until I reach the last row, which is the 8th row, in which case I will go back to the first row and repeat the process again. But what do you do when you get to the end of the pattern and you realize that the string colors don't match the ones that are on the top in the first row? Let's look at this pattern, for example. You can notice that the colors at the top don't match the colors at the bottom. The first string on the top is string A, but at the bottom it's string B. What do you do when that happens? This isn't necessarily complicated, it's just a little bit confusing. When the colors at the bottom don't match the colors at the top, all you do is you proceed with making the pattern ignoring the colors. The colors have changed. Unfortunately, the pattern doesn't represent that, but you still go about making the pattern the same way you would if the colors didn't change. Unfortunately, this is a little bit more confusing, as you can get confused between the colors, so I don't recommend making these patterns if you're not at least a little bit experienced with actually reading them. If you're looking to make your first pattern, probably check that the colors match before you go into making that, because that can get confusing. But when this happens, you ignore the colors and you just follow the pattern specifically. So in this pattern, you can see that the colors at the top completely don't match the colors at the bottom. So the colors at the bottom, B and D, the first and second color, when you loop the pattern and go back to row number 1, they turn into A and B, again the first and second color. By following the pattern directly, you take the first pair of string, which is now B and D, and you make a forward knot between the two. For the second pair, you can see that the colors become A and F by the end of the pattern, but when you loop back to the top, they get into the positions of C and D. Now again, I know that this is confusing, but you would just continue by making the pattern as it is suggested. You would take that pair of string, which is now A and F, and just make a forward knot. When the pattern colors don't match in a pattern, you just have to continue with the pattern, ignoring the colors. But what about patterns with holes in them? For this, let's check out this pattern, which is also a heart pattern. You can see that the entire first row only has 1 knot. The second row has 2, the third 3, the fourth 3, and so on. When the pattern indicates that there is no knot needs to be made. So following this pattern, you would arrange the strings as they are arranged at the top. In the first row, you would just take the pair with the 2 B strings and make a forward knot between those. In the second row, you would rearrange your strings, putting an A string and a B string together, and then for the second knot, a B string and an A string together, and you would make a backward knot between the first pair and a forward knot between the second pair. For the third row, you would once again rearrange your strings by putting A B together, A together, and B A together, and you would follow the pattern, making a backward knot with the first pair, a backward knot with the second pair, and a forward backward knot with the third pair. And as the pattern suggests, the knots that are not there, the missing knots, you just simply do not make them. These sort of bracelets tend to look a little bit different to the normal ones because you're missing out on the knots. The strings just tend to poke out. But this is another interesting way of making bracelets. Alright, so now let's talk about segment knotting. Going back to the chevron bracelet. As I said, if you've ever made a chevron bracelet, chances are you've probably already used segment knotting without even realizing it. The principle of segment knotting is trying to find a group of knots that can be made in one go. And by that I mean a group of knots that you're making with one string over a series of other strings. BraceletBook actually makes it very easy to follow a specific string because their patterns are interactable. You can hover your mouse over a specific string, which highlights that string to show how it moves throughout the pattern. So this first yellow string, string A, starts from the left outer edge of the bracelet and goes all the way into the middle with 4 consecutive forward knots. These 4 consecutive forward knots can be made in one go, which is probably what you've been doing if you've ever made a chevron. Chances are you've never made a chevron row by row, and you always take one string and do a row of knots onto all the other strings when you're making the chevron. This is exactly what the 4 consecutive forward knots in this pattern represent. Same goes for the orange strings, though it's not that visible in this specific pattern as there are only 4 rows represented. But if you highlight the second string, you can see that on row 3 and 4 there are 2 forward knots, and then the string is pushed into the second B string position. Looping back to row number 1, you can see that that goes into 2 more forward knots, resulting in the string going from the outermost edge on row number 2 to the center, back on the same row number 2, but after looping one more time. So looking at the yellow string and closely following our pattern, we can see specifically what knots are made on what strings. The first knot is of course made between the yellow and orange string. Then the second knot is made between the yellow and yellow. Third knot is made between another yellow and orange, and fourth between 2 yellows again. Let's check back to the heart pattern. This one is a little bit more complex. With the chevron, it's pretty clear as to how to group the strings together. 3 knots on the left, 3 knots on the right, and 1 knot in the center. so you can make that entire V shape in one go. With the heart pattern, the situation is a little bit more difficult. Trying to group knots together can seem a little bit difficult, but also can seem deceptively easy at times. Looking at this heart pattern, you may straight away see that the pink string goes from row 2 to row 4 in 3 consecutive forward knots. And from row 2 to 3, it does 2 consecutive backward knots. However, you can't just go into the bracelet and start making these knots. As all the strings work together to create the bracelet, they all depend on each other to be in the right positions. There is no correct way to segment knot. Every pattern can be segment knotted, and there are different ways to segment knot every pattern. But in this pattern specifically, I personally would start by making the first knot on the first row. Then I would make this little chevron in the center by doing a forward knot between the white and pink, a backward knot between the pink and white, and then straight away connecting the 2 white strings in the center. And then I would make the backward forward knot between the pink and the white. Now that we've done this, we've prepared all the strings to be in the positions to make the pink chevron. We can go ahead and make the pink chevron by doing a forward knot between the 2 pink strings on the left, another forward knot between the pink and the white, a backward knot between the 2 pinks on the right, a backward knot between the pink and the white, and then straight away we can connect the 2 pink strings in the center. Then on the same row, on row 3, I can notice that on the left and on the right I've got 2 single knots that can't be grouped with anything else, so I would just do them. I would do a backward knot on the left, a forward knot on the right. Next, I notice that there is another chevron, this time with the white string. And again, all the strings are now in the correct position for the chevron to be completed. So I again would do a chevron, taking the white strings on the left, doing a forward knot between them, another forward knot between the white and the pink, a backward knot between the 2 whites on the right, a backward knot between the white and pink, and then straight away a forward knot between the 2 white strings in the center. Now again, I notice another chevron straight away, and that is the closing chevron of the heart, the pink chevron. And this time, going straight from the outer edges, I do a chevron with the pink strings. Now there are only 4 knots left. I've got a forward backward knot on the left, a backward forward knot on the right, on row 7, and then on row 8 I've got a backward forward knot and a forward backward knot. These cannot be grouped with anything, so I would just do them individually. And once I've done that, I would go straight back around to row number 1 and start the pattern again. So this is the same exact pattern as we were using when we were reading it row by row. It's just a different method of reading the pattern. Now, after you've heard me say all that, you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed and you might be thinking that this is too complicated and you never want to try it. But once you do figure out how to do it, it saves you a lot of time and it makes knotting so much more enjoyable. So I definitely recommend trying to figure out segment knotting. Of course, if you've never read patterns before, I would highly suggest trying the row by row method first and only then going into segment knotting, but definitely at some point do try segment knotting. I think a great way to get the hang of segment knotting is watching the different tutorials that I make on bracelets. Whenever I make a tutorial on a bracelet, that tutorial is in segment knotting to make the bracelet easier to make and to memorize. But I always show the pattern on the screen as well to make it easier for you to follow. So if you're trying to figure segment knotting out, check out some of the tutorials that I've already made. I'll link some in the description below for you. Try to follow the tutorial, but also closely look at the pattern to try and understand how I'm piecing the pattern together and how I'm grouping the different knots together as well. I'm going to link some of my favorites down below for you to check out. Alright, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this video made sense to you. I know that that was a lot of information and that this is a little bit more complex, but I promise you, if you take the effort and learn how to make patterns, you will be amazed by the amount of possibilities that you will have. You can create so many intricate designs and so many beautiful bracelets by following different patterns that you will never lose this sense of creativity. The possibilities are absolutely endless. So definitely give reading patterns a try, and if you already are comfortable with the row by row method, definitely give segment knotting a try as well. As I said, it is a little bit more difficult, but it's so worth it once you do figure it out. I'm going to leave some patterns that I think are suitable for beginners to try down in the description, so you can check them out as well. And don't forget to check out BraceletBook. As I said, it is an amazing resource. It has so many patterns for you to try and so many great people for you to connect with. I also have an account on BraceletBook and I leave the link to it in all of my video descriptions. If you're ever looking for patterns to make or are just wondering on what I'm planning on making, you can always check my saved patterns on BraceletBook to see what I'm planning to do. And before I go, I want to give a special shout out to all of my patrons, but especially my top supporters. who are Sunshine, Tia, Izzy, Lisa, Mads, Jane, and Zoe. Thank you guys for your support, I really do appreciate it, and if you also want to become a patron and support the channel, there is a link in the description for you to sign up. I post videos on Wednesdays and Sundays, and sometimes I also post bonus videos, so keep your eyes out for that. Don't forget to check out BraceletBook, the link is in the description, and I will see you next time. Bye!